You know, on the front of the National Archives in Washington, D.C., it says, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Or I'm paraphrasing. But the bottom line is it says we need to remember our history. Well, our next guest is someone who's lived a lot of history and documented more. Welcome, Jim Van Buskirk. Welcome.
Thank you.
You know, I remember when we first met, I was so fascinated by your genuine love of history, which I share. You've been in San Francisco how long now?
45 years.
Does it ever strike you that we are living through a time when the importance of history or love of history isn't as much in our face? I mean, when you came here, didn't you have a sense that we were living through a real historic time or about to?
Yes, and I had no clue. And so it's interesting balance between living it, documenting it, revisiting it, and realizing all these years later, oh, we were at a historic moment. So it's interesting to know whether you realize that in the moment or whether it's down the line that it occurs.
And of course, I mean, hindsight is 20/20. Maybe I'm making too much of it, but I do remember, I've been here 30 years, that during the mid-'80s, I did get a sense of, because of the AIDS epidemic, because of so many pieces of legislation that were just virulently homophobic and everything else, that we were in the midst of great change. Did you think that 45 years ago?
Yes, and every 5 years for the last 45 years.
Where did you come from originally? How did you get here to San Francisco?
Well, I grew up in Southern California, and my family moved to the Pacific Northwest. And in the late 60s, early 70s, I thought, I need to be somewhere else. And I ended up in San Francisco, which I had always dreamed of being. But the reasons I ended up here were they played what I called foreign films, and they served strong coffee. Those were the two criteria that
You know, I've heard many reasons for moving to San Francisco, but that's a first. I've never heard that, foreign films and caffeine. What do you remember the most from your first experience of San Francisco? And how has it changed so drastically?
Well, I was just coming out. I mean, I had one foot out of the closet. I was probably 20. I wasn't 21, but I would go to the bars anyway. And I remember being very excited when I would see two men walking down the street together, not holding hands, out of the question, but just two men walking abreast down the sidewalk. That was thrilling to me.
And was this Castro or Polkstrasse then?
This was definitely not Castro. It was sort of Tenderloin, Polk Street. And I remember being taken to my first gay bar, which was the Alley Cat. And the friends that took me said, there was something about dancing. You couldn't touch the other person if you were dancing. So you could sort of dance adjacent, but there would be no touching.
Feeling. Yeah.
And they even told me that if a light went on or off, whatever it was, absolutely sit down.
That would mean a raid.
It was a raid. And this was 1970, 71.
Right. You know, I think so much of the fascination with the 1970s, whether it's the film Milk or whatnot, it's painted as this great golden era, but it wasn't easy to be gay in San Francisco in the 70s. You were still being hassled.
Still being hassled, called names. It was an interesting period.
Now, you and one of your collaborators, Susan Stryker, collaborated on an incredible book. I think it's still one of the best queer history books around there, Out by the Bay.
Gay by the Bay.
Gay by the Bay. When did you realize that you had a history that not only you were living, but that you needed to write about and document?
Well, I remember meeting Susan, who I had not known prior to that, and the Hormel Gay and Lesbian Center was opening in 1996.
In the main library, the new main.
The new main, right? The 20-year-old new
main library, right?
And she, at that point, was on the board of the GLBT Historical Society. And she said, well, what are you going to be doing? It was just after the 1993 March on Washington, and then followed by the New York exhibit becoming visible. And so
it was a moment.
It was a moment. Our history was at the forefront. And I said, oh, an exhibit? I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what we're going to do. And we got together for coffee and we talked about we needed to have an exhibit and what an opportunity to focus on the Historical Society's 10-year anniversary and the brand new Hormel Center. So in the process, I said, ever the librarian, I said, well, if we're going to go to all the trouble of having an exhibition, let's document it. Let's have an exhibition catalog. And somewhere along the line, our whole project flipped.
And the catalog became the book.
The catalog became the book. We did exhibits based on it, but it was the other way around. And that project was so exciting. One, I rediscovered and discovered our own history. But as I like to say, and I think Chronicle Books did a great job with the design. It looks terrific. But the best thing to come out of that project was my deep and abiding friendship with Susan.
Yeah. So it's been 21 years since that. More.
Well, it came out just when the new main library opened, so it will have been 20 years.
Would have been 20 years. Is it time now for Gay by the Bay 2? I mean, did you ever think 20 years ago that the number one topic for the gay community, and tell me if you disagree with that, but during the aught years was going to be same-sex marriage? We weren't talking about that in the 90s.
We were not. We were absolutely not. Or gays in the military. But by the same token, we have always been talking about those things. So it sort of comes in cycles. I mean, I remember from 1966, a flyer saying, I think it was 66, about gays in the military.
Right.
So it's what goes around comes around, I guess.
What do you think the millennial generation feels about LGBT history? I mean, I speak to people all the time, my generation, younger, older, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but there seems to be a sense of, oh, we have same-sex marriage, we can do this, we can do that, I can go on an Atlantis cruise, I can do whatever as an openly gay person. You know, the time of great historical moment has passed for our community.
Well, I would say it's shifted, but it's certainly not past, not by any means, when queer kids are getting bullied in the schools.
Or thrown off roofs in the Arab world.
Right, or yes. And, you know, trans people are being killed in the United States on a regular basis. The prisons, trans in prison. I mean, so we're not quite in that post-queer society that we might think we are. Yes, things have changed, things have improved, but we still have a long way to go.
So what projects are you working on now? What next are we going to see from you as far as documentation or work or just field of interest?
Well, exactly now, this morning, I've been working on the exhibits celebrating the 20th anniversary of the opening of the Hormel Center, and we're calling it Queerest Library Ever, hashtag Hormel at 20. Of course, hashtag had to be explained to me. I had no idea what it was.
It probably had to be explained to Jim Hormel, too.
So, and one of the exciting things about the project is that we are going back and sort of documenting that history, which really started 25 years ago with the first press conference announcing the formation of the center before Jim Hormel came on board.
Absolutely, I remember it. It was one of the first things that I was, donated to as a gay man. I was like, oh, there's going to be a space in a library just devoted to LGBT history. That was, nowadays it seems kind of yawn, but then it was quite
I think it might have been the very first time.
I think it was the very first.
And the fact that it wasn't an add-on, that they were building a new building, and from the foundation, this was going to be an intrinsic, important part of the building, of the collection. It was pretty exciting. And so in the process of doing the documentation, we've created a little documentary. And so we invited some of the early supporters like Steve Coulter, whose idea it was.
Now the Library Commission.
He was on the Library Commission. The Chief of Facilities, Kathy Page, Jan Zivick, who was another founding funder, and Jim Hormel came in. And it was so much fun to sit with him and reminisce about the challenges and the rewards. And he said something really moving. He said, because he's such a generous philanthropist across the board, and he said that the number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 most important project to him is the Hormel Center.
Wow.
So that was meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. My first job was as a library page, so I've always been a lover of books, and there was something very emotional about going into a library and not having to go to the shelves and furtively look for the 601.2 or what I think that was the Dewey Decimal for case studies, and kind of check it out quickly or maybe hide it, and actually go in and see a sign that said Hormel Gay and Lesbian Center. It's like we were out as far as a culture. Go ahead.
Well, and we've revisited the guest book that we had on display in April of '96. And those entries are so moving because people come from wherever they come from. Finally, I see myself. My community is represented, and this is such a beautiful space, and I'm so proud to be gay, or I'm proud of the library for welcoming me. And as the days go by, it's not just people from San Francisco, it's people from across the United States and then across the world. So it's really a valuable resource.
We've just got about a minute left. Talk to me about what is your favorite historic moment in the 45 years you've lived here.
Wow.
One that really stands out and you're like, boy, I was here on that day at this moment when this happened.
Well, what springs to mind is where I wasn't. I remember getting a call from a college chum on the night of the White Night riots. And
The riots that followed the
verdict.
The verdict, which basically let off Dan White for
Exactly.
killing Milk and Moscone.
And she says, if you watch the news, you know what's going on. Why aren't you down at City Hall? And I realized I did not want to be at City Hall. So I consider myself an activist in what I do, but I was not going to put my physical body in that melee.
Yeah, because a lot of people were hurt. And now, of course, there's a whole generation of people for whom you have to explain who was Harvey Milk and who was George Moscone. As always, Jim, it's a great pleasure speaking with you. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Jim Van Buskirk about LGBT history in San Francisco and the 20th anniversary of the Hormel Center. I'm David Perry. Thanks for making history every week and watching California's longest-running LGBT TV show, 10%. We'll see you next week.